Hi, in this video I'm going to go over something called constructive skepticism. Some skepticism that we have is well-founded, and it's a good thing that we're skeptical, and we're going to talk about that, and we're going to talk about why skepticism can be good and bad and how to distinguish between those. So, and especially from like a biblical standpoint, I see a lot of people in the church, but also in secular society who tend to fall into some of these things. So, so I was reading scripture yesterday, night before last, I think, in Psalms, and I've been in Psalms basically most of the night, before bed, and so I wanted to go to sleep, and I really felt I should go to Proverbs. So I turned over pretty quick, and I don't usually blindly point or anything, but I opened it and I prayed God, show me what you want me to see in this, because I really sensed He wanted to show me something, and my eyes landed on Proverbs 18:13, which says, "He who answers a matter before he hears it, it is folly and shame to him." Okay, and a couple of the verses I want to look at before we kind of get into this and unpack this thing is Matthew 10:16, which says, "Behold, I send you forth as sheep in the midst of wolves. Be ye therefore wise as serpents and harmless as doves." And finally, 2 Timothy 2:15, "Be diligent to present yourself approved to God, a worker who does not need to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth." Okay, so it's within the context of these three verses that I want to look at this. Also, Isaiah 1:18, "Come now, let us reason together." I always like that one as well, for anything that is looking at like the logical interpretation of Scripture or understanding in general. I think a lot of people tend to think that you have to check your brain at the door of the church, which is completely not true. And if you believe that's true, you should work on that thought. So anyway, so let's get into this. So to go back up again, I want to read that verse one more time. "He who answers a matter before he hears it, it is folly and shame to him." Okay, and so so a lot of times what I see happen is, and I'm going to keep this basically theological or church-based discussion here, is we are faced with a couple options, right? Like we are faced with two theologies or two. It doesn't even have to be a theology, really. For those who know what Codex Sinaiticus is and the antithetical argument to Codex Sinaiticus, that could be one. There's a bunch of them. Anyway, but we're faced with these different doctrines, different things, and the general idea is that you go to a church and you believe what they believe, right? And so you don't really think about it necessarily or question it, or it just becomes how you learned it, right? And so when we're faced with these two different options, sometimes that leads into it, because usually, at least in the church, there is a good chance that most things are fairly scriptural, right? So there's Bible there, right? And so we have a general tendency to believe, well, okay, this thing that we learned at church, lines up with Scripture, right? And so what happens is we form a bias, and so we form a bias, and we often don't think about it that way. We don't think about it like it's a bias. We think about it like that's what we learned, that's what we grew up with. I grew up reading the New King James Version. I like the New King James Version. Don't tell me about Codex Sinaiticus and how the newer versions might be off because of several reasons. Anyway, I'm not going to get too deep into that. That's a confusing topic, and there's some good stuff on that from other people. But anyway, we tend to believe that what we learned is correct, right? So we tend to believe that, and we tend to form this bias. And then what happens is we tend to not look at this argument as valid, right? Because we have this bias built in, and it's a part of us. It is a known marketing fact that if you can rank for social media, or sorry, for SEO, People that go out onto a search engine and find their own results are biased of them. Okay, so when you rank for SEO, you have a better chance to engage with the customer and have them, believe in, if they find you first, for instance. So I mean, as long as, all things being equal, if they find you first, like, they found you on social media, they own that process of digging you up, right? So, so there's these different things that are biased, and it may not even be the best service you find online, but this happens. It's anyway. So when we're looking at something new, we have this bias sometimes working against us. Okay, now remember, constructive skepticism. Of course we should be skeptical. Wise as serpents, innocent as doves, right? Exactly. But it's possible, and I wrote this down, we're often very quick to be skeptical of a view that aligns against our own bias, but we often forget to be skeptical of the bias itself, okay? And at this point, I want to, well, actually, first off, if this argument is not biblical, okay, of course it doesn't go, right? But if the premise is that both arguments are biblical, okay, and yet they're incompatible together and they're juxtaposed, right? Like they can't possibly exist in unison, right? Then we have a problem. One of these has to be wrong, the other has to be correct. Okay, simple logic, right? So let's look at some biases. And if you've never seen these are critical thinking cards, all right? Yeah, you can buy your pack at, what does it say? Oh, schoolofthought.org. I think they have a different actual shop site. There's two different websites. But anyway, you can get logical fallacies and biases, lists of them. You can go online and find these too. But some really, really good ones. The Dunning-Kruger effect. The less you know, the more confident you're likely to be. Okay? So if you don't know both sides of this, but you only know one, and you grew up knowing it from church, okay? Dunning-Kruger effect. You don't know both sides, and yet you're pretty solidly certain that you're that you know that's correct, right? Or anchoring. The first thing you judge influences all judgment that follows. So human minds are associative in nature, and so the order in which we receive information helps determine the course of our judgments and perceptions. All right. There's some other ones. Confirmation bias. You favor things that confirm your existing beliefs. All right. There's a lot of these. Yeah, if a conclusion supports your existing belief, you rationalize anything that supports it, rather than actually looking at the tenets of what is juxtaposed. See, that's the constructive part of the criticism. If you're looking at the details between the two arguments and you're analyzing them in context to Scripture, now you're in a better position to make a sound decision. Groupthink. You let the social dynamics of a group situation, like church, okay, override the best outcomes or the best judgments in between the two, right? Yeah, so there's a bunch of these. I'm not going to get into all of them, but these are really good. And then I also really recommend the logical fallacy. So, I think most people avoid looking at new stuff and looking at, the antithetical viewpoint because it's not convenient, because we tend to follow the crowd. We tend to get sucked into groupthink. And it really, getting pulled into groupthink is the opposite of 2 Timothy 2:15. It doesn't say, to study your pastor to show yourself approved, right? It doesn't show that. It says study the word to show yourself approved. So anyway, so in terms of constructive criticism versus destructive criticism, or sorry, skepticism, constructive skepticism versus destructive skepticism. Destructive skepticism is to not be skeptical, about our own bias in how that affects our judgments. Not being skeptical of what we believe. It could be a destructive skepticism. Or it's like not being skeptical, I guess, being too trusting. And then, but like constructive skepticism is to say, okay, yes, I should be skeptical of this new piece of information, but I should also monitor my own bias and what's the balance. The balance isn't actually found here. The balance is found here, right? Like we tend to focus on like, well, or we don't even focus on it really. Like we're oftentimes oblivious to the fact we have this bias. And we're making judgments, hard judgments on something that's in front of us without weighing in the bias factor, and or even understanding and being able to articulate the biases that we have, and these are tools. I mean, these are thinking tools, and they're really worth learning, and being able to analyze yourself, to be able to analyze arguments you encounter, being able to analyze things that you think you know. These are valuable. They're invaluable, actually. But it's really a matter of taking our tendency to make quick decisions based off of familiarity or bias or whatever you want to call it, and putting the focus back where it should be, which is on Scripture, and when it comes to these, juxtaposed, options, like which one do we choose from a logical standpoint, and how do we determine the logic? Like, what are the rules? What are the rules of logic? And by looking at these things and understanding how to do that, it's a skill set. It really is. To be able to look at something and not just say, well, it's wrong. My pastor said so, and being able to say, okay, this is why it's wrong. And then again, like it does require actually understanding both sides. Of whatever theological aspect you're looking at. So, be skeptical. Be constructive in your skepticism. Okay, that's it.